Hi everybody, welcome to the 2016 Winter Art of Education Conference. My name is Belleville. I teach in Baltimore City, Maryland at the Baltimore Design School. It is a public school, it is an urban school, and I teach 8th grade design explorations as well as AP art history to 10th and 11th graders. I'm here today to talk to you about design thinking. There are a lot of buzzwords floating around in education, there's no need to tell you, and the question always is, how does this actually apply to my classroom? What do these words actually mean? So what I've done is I've taken design thinking, art thinking, and general education thinking, broken it down and kind of coded it to figure out what are people actually saying when they're talking about these theories, and what does this actually look like in an art classroom? So join me as we look at some research. I've tried to make it as entertaining as possible so that you don't fall asleep when I say the word research. Design thinking and art making can exist collaboratively. Please email me with any questions, further comments, contributions at rebeccabelleville@gmail.com. So where is our focus? When we're talking about art thinking, design thinking, educational thinking, any types of theories that are floating around in education really comes down to me asking myself, where is the focus and how does this apply to my classroom? So what I did is I took a couple of different pieces of research for each category, for art thinking, design thinking, and educational thinking, and coded it. I really looked at what is the criteria for this field of thought, and what does this break down to? So I created these 5 categories: the spirit of inquiry, experiential, community-centered, introspection, and refinement clarification. So with art thinking, the emphasis was on the spirit of inquiry, really thinking about how are we asking questions? What are we getting our students to investigate? What questions are they asking when we come up with a theme or essential question are they answering, and how are they creating sub-questions, right? The second focus was experiential learning, the doing, the making, the thing a lot of people think of when they think of the art classroom. I know I get a lot of questioning about why are my students writing so much? Shouldn't they just be making and drawing and doing? And as an art teacher, we all know that there's a balance that is needed. So this is really focused on the experiential being secondary to the spirit of inquiry. Then you have community-centeredness, refinement, clarification, that editing process, and then the introspective process. In design thinking, you see that the emphasis is on experience. It's really on the creating, the doing, the iterations, the testing, the prototyping, these kind of words that may kind of make you glaze over. You think of a science experiment instead of an art classroom or a design classroom, but it really is intrinsic to the process. The second understanding is kind of tied between the refinement, clarification, and the spirit of inquiry, really editing, and through the editing process asking those questions. And then community-centeredness. So you see that there's really kind of an evenness between the spirit of inquiry, community-centeredness, and refinement clarification, with the experiential learning leading the pack. With educational thinking, you see a more even understanding of the top 3, spirit of inquiry, experiential learning, and community-centeredness, and introspection and refinement clarification kind of on the back end. So the research I looked at when I'm talking about the words art thinking, design thinking, and educational thinking are 2 things. For art thinking, I looked at The Studio Habits of Mind by Lois Hetland and Ellen Winter, and I looked at Art 21's contemporary art practices in the classroom. So what I did is both of these, well, obviously the Studio Habits of Mind are a research, and the Art 21 list is based off of research as well as a different art educators' understandings of what is important in the classroom. So it's kind of more field research than an academic piece of research. So the Studio Habits of Mind have this kind of beautiful flow to them where they focus on the spirit of inquiry, refinement clarification, then community-centeredness, experiential learning, and then introspection. Whereas Art 21's focus really is on the spirit of inquiry, asking good questions, getting your students to understand why they should be asking questions, how are they leading the investigation, and not just simply responding to a prompt from the teacher. Then secondary to that is experiential learning, again, the making. From there, there's a bit of community-centeredness, so moving from the personal to the social political. So here, with these 2 research studies under the term art thinking, we're really thinking about how are our students creating questions for themselves that they are then answering through the making process. When we look at design thinking, I'm looking at 3 different pieces of research. I'm looking at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. I'm looking at the D School at Stanford, D stands for design, and I'm looking at the IDEO design process. So these are coded a little bit differently, which is really interesting, but you'll notice that the Hasso-Plattner Institute and the D School, their number 1 criteria, which is the green criteria, community-centeredness, is empathy or human-centeredness. So really what we're looking at here is the very first thing that people are talking about when they're talking about design thinking is empathy, the other person. Then from there, we see a split between refinement, clarification, kind of clarifying what does this person need, and the experiential understanding of what we're going to do. So here we've got a lot of experiential learning, a lot of refinement, clarification, and inquiry, the spirit of inquiry. So you notice that the big difference between art thinking and design thinking is that sense of empathy. With the educational thinking, a more general understanding of education, not necessarily the art classroom, but also included in the art classroom, are the 21st century skills, learning and innovation skills, and life and career skills, as well as a Ramsey Muslim TED Talk, which obviously TED Talk is not necessarily research-based in a very academic sense, but it is a understanding of education in a simplified form. So here we've got, again, another large emphasis on the spirit of inquiry, as well as community-centeredness, experiential learning, and introspection, kind of all 5 of those categories. So what does this mean for the art classroom? Well, art classroom, I have a simple equation for you based on the research and the coding. Art classroom equals the spirit of inquiry plus experiential learning, and then introspection, whereas the design classroom is the spirit of inquiry plus experiential learning plus community. So again, you really see the difference here is this focus on community. So what does this mean for my specific classroom? What have I been thinking about? Well, 1, teaching middle school is not that easy. 2, teaching middle school in Baltimore City Public Schools is also not that easy. So I'm constantly asking myself, what can I do to get my students engaged? What can I do to make them thinking a little bit deeper, not just doing surface level work? How can I get them moving beyond themselves? As a 12 to 14-year-old, you're incredibly selfish and self-centered. So how can I get my students thinking beyond themselves to their community, to their country, to the world, right? So the first thing I've done is I've created this kind of flow chart that I use in my classroom, and I've coded it based on the research that I did. Now, you may look at this and feel a little overwhelmed and say, Becca, I have a 30-minute class with my students once a week. How am I supposed to really integrate this into my lessons? Well, not everything is a lesson. Not each of these arrows is a lesson. Some of them may take a couple of minutes. Some of them may take an entire lesson. It just depends on where your emphasis is in the classroom. So let's move through this really quickly. The first idea is to brainstorm and identify a concept. Then mind map the facets of the concept. So I really want students thinking about what is this thing that we are talking about and what could it be? Then from there, the students are developing research questions. Something that I'm very, very fond of is having my students create their own essential questions. Now, some of these essential questions may be very elementary. That is okay. We want to refine that and look into what those answers could be. I find a lot of success in my AP Art History class developing their own essential questions. Really helps them with the essay writing portion of the class and really gets them into thinking about what am I really trying to look at when I look at art history. But from there, from that development of the research question, you have the personal understanding of the concept, which is an introspective piece. Student sits there and figures out, okay, in my life experience, this is what I understand about the concept. Now here's where we have the shift from the art thinking to the design thinking, and that is, again, of empathy. I have the students interview another student about their understanding of the concept that student A is created for their work. So say I have work that I am creating on identity. And I have created this facet of identity that I'm investigating through a self-portrait, and I write this stuff down, and now I want to talk to my friend and see what is their understanding of identity. So I interview them and say, oh, I didn't realize that you're talking about this portion of your identity and I'm thinking about this portion. So it's really forcing students to have an empathetic understanding of what they're investigating in their art making process. So then from there, the student creates an action plan and again goes back for peer feedback, asking like, what do you think of this? And the other student gives them a praise question polish. I think these things are going well. I think these things need some help. And here's my question about the overall process. Again, these are things you have to train into your students. They're not going to naturally open up to each other and ask good questions. Good questioning is a process. So from there, once you've got the action plan with the peer feedback, you've got your studio time with revision, you have the students creating, making, doing, performing, whatever it is that is their art piece or their design piece, and revising with a clarification. Then they have the presentation plan with peer critique, the reflection/presentation, and then from there, the assessment piece, which really has been going on the entire time. There's a lot of formative assessment in this process, but the summative assessment is either a self or group assessment. I really focus on my students assessing themselves as part of this process, because my ultimate goal for my students is to create autonomous learners. No one needs a teacher sitting there telling them exactly what to think and how to think. We need to be teaching our students how to think on their own. So my kind of guidance for myself that I'm always asking myself whenever I create a unit plan or talk to my students is, how am I creating critical and empathetic thinkers in my classroom? The large difference between art thinking and design thinking is that of empathy. So I really think that those lines between art and design are being blurred with contemporary artists and are being blurred in the contemporary classroom. Thank you again for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.